thank you. Are these on? Do we have to do anything? They're on. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. We're really excited to be here. I'm really excited to be able to have this conversation with Frank. We're going to talk for about half an hour, maybe, then have Q&A from you. And this is the book, The Age of Grievance. And it's, I think, a really important contribution to this discussion we're having about why we're in the political moment that we're in, why we're so polarized, why we are experiencing this moment of completely apocalyptic politics. Our democratic institutions seem to be undergoing a gigantic stress test. And I want to ask you, first of all, why did you decide that grievance was the lens through which we should understand this moment?
Well, first of all, can I thank you for doing this tonight, for being here with me? I'm such a lifelong admirer. It's so generous of you to do it. And
I'm happy to be here. It's my pleasure.
I'm flattered and honored to be here with you, so thank you. And thank you all. And thank you all for coming out tonight when you could be listening to a Joe Biden news conference.
That's right. It's happening at this very moment.
If anybody sees anything really interesting on their smartphone, please let us know.
Yeah.
You know, the answer to your question is a kind of embarrassingly uncomplicated one, which is I kind of began to notice 5 years ago how a word that I'd not seen in that much journalism before, grievance, was coming up again and again. And it was often in relation to the MAGA movement and Donald Trump supporters, but it was also in relation to other things. And when people were just kind of like looking at what was happening in politics, talking about it, they talked about how this group, this person was bringing these grievances to the table. And I thought, I didn't used to see this word all the time, but what I realized even more was when I'd seen the word in the distant past, it was kind of value neutral. It was not seen as a bad word. I mean, if you go back in the First Amendment to the Constitution, they talk about us having the right to have our grievances redressed, and that is a positive notion of grievance. If you just started as a kind of personal study to look from now for the next couple of weeks at every time you see the word grievance in the press or you hear it on TV, and you'll see it and hear it all the time, it almost always has a negative connotation. And as I kind of observed that, I realized it's because our grievances they've metastasized and they've become indiscriminate, right? People mix together urgent complaints that are tied to absolutely kind of necessary vital causes. They mix together that and kind of petty slights, imagined slights, and it has the evolution and transmogrification of that word. In that, I think you see a reflection of what has gone wrong and continues to go wrong with our politics.
So this book came out in April, and a whole lot has happened in American politics since then. And I'm wondering what you wish you could have included in the book that's happened since then, and especially about the election, because this is the grievance election. Yeah. We are a really long way from I'm a uniter, not a divider, and there are no red states, there are no blue states, there's just the United States. Now we're at I am your retribution.
Yeah.
I mean, and that is the rallying cry of grievance politics. So what's happened since April that if you could write an addendum, you would do that?
Boy, I'm really hard-pressed to think of anything interesting that has happened in the political world since April. I mean, unfortunately, one answer to that question is I would write about the last week or the last 8 to 10 days, and I would write about how distressing I found it, how depressing I found it, to listen to and watch Joe Biden's reaction to what I believe, and we may have differences of opinion about this, and that's great. We should all, differences of opinion are great, and we should have reasoned, calm discussions about them. But I believe the questions that have been raised about him since that June 27th debate are absolutely sensible. I think they're necessary. And to hear him steal lines and a kind of emotional temperature from the Trump playbook and make it about, this is just the elites. Where have we heard that before? This is just the negative bias media. Where have we heard that before? He was edging up on almost using the word fake news. And what I find so interesting and distressing about that, beyond the obvious things and where it connects to the book, is we're in a moment in time where if you want to get out of a scrape, if you want to kind of appeal to people, if you want to kind of mint an instant currency, you make yourself a victim and you start articulating your grievances. And the way he's done that in the last 8 days is almost inevitable and predictable given where our culture is, but it's also, to me, a distressing, depressing sign of the supremacy of grievance.
Well, grievances have been around forever. I mean, and that's how out-groups make their argument against the in-group. Right. But what's different about the moment we're in right now? I mean, especially in the United States, you're saying that in the book that the United States is an especially even singular theater or a laboratory for grievance.
Well,
explain that.
There's a lot that's different now, but I'm going to take the second part of your question first, if that's okay. I think the United States is such a singular laboratory for grievance because, I mean, grievances are connected to disappointments, and what makes us so great as a country is also what makes this such a challenging country. When you promise people an endless frontier, when you say that your life can be as big as your dreams and your initiative and your grit and all that sort of stuff, you're setting the terms of a nation that does accomplish things other nations don't. It's what makes us great, but you're also setting up a situation where people are going to be disappointed. If you kind of study like where are people happiest in the world or under what circumstances and at what times are people most content, it's never about any sort of simple measure of material wealth or security or all that. It's what are their lives like vis-a-vis what they expected their lives to be, or what is this moment like for them vis-a-vis what they expected the moment to be. In this country, you know, the engine of our greatness is how big we encourage people to dream. But like encoded in that is the reality that certain people are not going to realize those dreams, they're going to be disappointed. And it is far easier when you're disappointed with your life to find an external cause, to find someone else or something else to blame for that, than to look inside. And so we have the sort of makings, the ingredients of grievance in a way that not every other country has to this intensity. We're also, and it's something I hadn't thought about that much until I'd written the book, and I talked to some people, some politicians like Ro Khanna, Pete Buttigieg, they're quoted in the book about this. We're trying something in this country that's never been really tried before, that we don't have any kind of precedent where we can say we're going to succeed because look at this historical example, just follow that model over there. Nobody's done a democracy with this at this scale, with this scale of diversity like we have. And it runs counter to the tribalism that is a part of human nature, and it's another thing that feeds into grievance. And makes whether this country can overcome grievances and find stable, long-lasting success and continue to have a healthy democracy. It's what makes it kind of so important and one of a kind.
But I really need you to explain kind of bad grievance versus good grievance. Grievances are how people make political change. There's nothing inherently wrong with having a criticism or a critique of the status quo. But you said that ours is an era of mass immaturity. In other words, I agree. I think everyone is a whining snowflake having a tantrum, starting with Sam Alito. I mean, he's the most elitist, aggrieved guy you can imagine. But so what I'm trying to figure out is what's unique about this that makes grievance a sign of almost societal, I don't want to say collapse, but decline, because that's the argument you're making.
Yes.
Let's
use Alito because he's a really good example.
Yeah.
And in fact, in the first 10 pages of the book, I talk about him and Clarence Thomas. But I talk about what happened. So he wrote the majority of opinion that overturned Roe v. Wade, right? The Dobbs opinion. And whatever you think about the jurisprudence of that, whatever you think about the public policy element of that, put all of that to the side. He had to know, as an ostensibly intelligent human being who lives in this country and this culture, he had to know that was going to cause enormous upset because it was changing the status quo of decades. Right. It was affecting a lot of people's lives in the most kind of personal and consequential way, right? He had to know that, and you kind of have to know when you are appointed to the Supreme Court. And by the way, you have now been given kind of the greatest compliment.
Yes,
you're
he's the
occupying
elitist elite there is.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're the elitist elite there is. You're as lucky a human being as ever existed. And you've just written a majority of opinion that is going to be convulsive to a society. And he went out on the speaking circuit and did this woe is me tour about, boy, they're really saying nasty things about us. It's really terrible.
If you don't like gay marriage, you're called a bigot, wham, wham, wham.
Right, it's so hard to be me. You want an example of a stupid grievance? That's a stupid grievance.
Yes. All right, well, we're gonna get to some other...
But he understood. I mean, this brings us... these things are not equivalent. I'm not making
Right.
any false equivalences, but I talked about Biden a little bit. He understood what Biden understood when Biden said, it's just the elites, it's just the media, I'm sick of being beat up on by them. He understood that when you make yourself the recipient of bad treatment, when you say, I am being treated unfairly, I've gotten a raw deal, that has this kind of perverse cultural currency right now.
Yeah. Okay, I want you to read a passage from the book because we're going to get back to politics and what this means for American politics, but you broaden out grievance into a whole lot of other areas. And in one passage of the book, which I'd like you to read, you make a point about our service economy and how it fuels grievance. And, then we'll talk about culture too, but yeah, just read that.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'll do my best to kind of balance this on my lap and all of that. When I was a teenager in the late 1970s and early 1980s and went to the big concerts of major performers, different sections of seating had different prices, but they fell into a few general categories. A person's proximity to the stage often had less to do with her financial reserves than with how quickly and heroically she'd acted to get her tickets. I once showed up at the box office of what was then called the Hartford Civic Center at 3 a.m. in pitch darkness to be in place when tickets for a Queen concert went on sale several hours later. That was the surest path to the best seats. My friends and I ended up in the 8th row, where I caught Freddie Mercury's tambourine when he threw it into the crowd at the conclusion of the band's final song. And there was something egalitarian about it. But the seating maps for various stops on Taylor Swift's 2023 tour revealed scores and scores of price tags, tailored with extreme specificity to the precise desirability of the vantage point. The highest ones were many thousands of dollars above the lowest ones, a family of 4 or 5 posting photos of themselves, among other ecstatic Swifties at Showtime, as Showtime neared, was in some cases announcing to the world its ability to drop $10,000 or more on one night's entertainment. But while the price range for Swift exceeded the price range for a garden variety superstar, the exacting tiering of the experience was a common phenomenon in the world of live music. When I was a teenager, school essentially came in 2 sizes, public or private. Now private is the starting point with many costly but broadly applied add-ons, the tutors for special subjects, the separate tutor for standardized exams, the individual sports coach, the independent college admissions consultant who, for a hefty fee, does more plotting and pacifying than the counselors already on the school staff are able to. When I was a teenager, you were posh if you belonged to a private gym versus, say, the YMCA. The brand of that gym and the level of your membership weren't relevant. Now, Planet Fitness and Equinox are solar systems of pampering apart. And at some of the equinoxes of the galaxy, different clients pay significantly different sums for personal trainers in accordance with that ab whisperer's determined gradation of expertise. Those clients can also pay a surcharge for a better locker room, a surcharge for certain other sanctums. And none of that is unnoticed by or unnoticeable to the other customers. Its noticeableness is perhaps part of the point. Aspiration and perspiration go together. The emphasis of the American economy may have changed over the years from manufacturing to services, but one product we make in abundance is distinctions.
Yeah. Well, that's also about inequality and the lack of shared experiences. Although you were all sharing an experience, some of you guys got to sit closer to the stage than others.
Right.
We'll get back to that in a minute when we talk about solutions for this. Okay. But I want to ask you about the way that grievance is kind of politically distributed. It seems like grievance is more of a tool of the right, because right-wing demagogues have used grievance forever and ever, and Donald Trump is the grievance politician. But in your book, you have a lot of examples of left-wing grievance, too. I mean, there are whining snowflakes on all ends of the political spectrum. So if you could talk about that a little bit, and also about your experience teaching at Duke, and whether you find your students to be aggrieved. Yes, aggrieved about
microaggressions,
and yeah. So, yeah, first talk about,
Well, let me give you,
who
because
uses grievance better?
Well,
politically?
I don't know if I can do that, but I want to give an example
Yeah.
of the way in which the left uses grievance, because
Yeah.
I think sometimes people don't see it and don't realize how corrosive the impact is. So to use something that we're, I think, all familiar with or all remember, when Brittany Griner was horrifically imprisoned in Russia, right? And there was a question of whether she would get back, whether she would get out, et cetera. I saw commentary in liberal, left-leaning publications, and when I say publications, I often mean online, whatever, that made the claim that she was languishing and receiving less attention from Americans and from the American government because she was black, because she was lesbian, and because she was a woman, right? These were grievance entrepreneurs taking three very important causes, and that's what's troubling about this. Taking very important causes, sexism, racism, or very important problems, say sexism, racism, homophobia. And because those were their calling cards to complain about those things, because their kind of pundit or commercial model was to see those things everywhere they looked, they were applying it to the Brittany Griner situation. I was more conscious of and got more reminders about and saw the federal government doing much more about Brittany Griner's situation because she was a celebrity than any other political prisoner in recent years I can remember. I only learned
that white guy Whalen
I
is
only
still
learned
in jail.
about Paul Whalen
Yeah,
because he was the 10th paragraph or 11th paragraph
right.
of a Brittany Griner story. When you have these merchants of grievance, when you have this kind of reflex of grievance, you really undermine important causes. Because if I'm someone who thinks that cries of sexism and homophobia and racism are overwrought, I see something like that and I think they're as crazy on that side of the aisle as I think they are. Because she is not being ignored, she's not getting too little attention, and now I've lost all credibility, and I've given those people who want to tune out this important subject matter, I've given them a reason to do so. You see that sort of indiscriminate and very dangerous application of grievance on the left all the time.
All right, let's talk about your students at Duke. Are they whining snowflakes obsessed with microaggressions, or are they young people who are going to go on to save the planet and restore our democracy?
So this is being recorded, and my students have the opportunity to evaluate me. No. But no, this is an honest answer. I mean, the media picks up on things and reports on things happening on campuses that are true. But we've reduced this generation of students to caricature, and I cannot say a single thing about my students. I cannot give you a single generalization that is really true. They are as complicated and different one to the next as all people are, as those of us in this room are. But there are things you notice there are things I notice that trouble me. And I talk about these lenses that we apply to automatically and reflexively. I remember the very first class I taught at Duke, we were talking in the context of that class about certain changes over time. And I was asking if anybody had any ideas of why in the Republican Party, gay rights and same-sex marriage, the feelings about those things among Republicans had changed significantly, in what I would consider a more positive direction over time. But at that, when we were talking about this, but the abortion numbers hadn't changed much. And I'm like, anyone have a theory as to why that might be the case? And very pleased with herself, one of my students raised her hand, and she said, white supremacy. And I was kind of braced for it because in a lot of academic environments today, white supremacy is the correct answer to anything. It is how you show how sophisticated you are. And again, to go back to Brittany
Even
Griner,
though it's the most intellectually flabby thing you can do. Yeah.
And the problem is, it's true in many cases, and we need to make sure that we call it out in those cases, but when it just becomes... So I said to her, explain to me how white supremacy is the answer. And she said, well, white women get abortions at a much higher rate than women of color. And so the Republican Party wants to make sure to preserve a white majority country. And I had to say to her, are you going to be surprised if I tell you have it exactly opposite? That in fact, women of color, black women, get abortions at 3 or 4 times the rate per capita. And she looked like I just told her I saw Bigfoot at the student cafeteria, right? That couldn't be the case. That's the kind of thing I've seen that troubles me because they have somehow, they're the products of an educational system, and not just at the university level, but K through 12, that tells them that the badge of intellectual sophistication is to see oppression everywhere. and to make it the answer to everything. But I've also seen stuff that really, really gives me hope. I spend a lot of time in my classes whenever there's an opportunity talking about the way they use social media and whether they've set up their social media universe, their feeds, whatever you want to call it, whether they've set those up in a way that actually is aligned with what they intended and what their values are. And if you talk to them about that, they realize that they haven't. They're very interested in kind of that self-examination. They're very interested in making adjustments. They don't want to be the kind of ideologically and politically one-note creatures that they sometimes end up being. And as soon as you talk to them about that, you find them able to be more self-aware, more self-critical, and more interested in self-improvement than the caricatures in the media suggest.
Well, that's good. We're glad to hear that. You spend a lot of the book talking about politics, and we're going to get back to that, but you also talk about how grievance is reflected in popular culture, in movies and music and books. Where do you see that?
Does anybody, and if you've read the book, you can't answer this question, but does anybody know what the most watched, popular by many, many light years program that Netflix has ever run is?
No. What?
Squid Game.
Oh, Squid Game.
Squid Game. Popular in particular with people in their teens and 20s.
And explain what it is for those of us who don't know.
Squid Game is about a society in which income inequality is so profound, and in which the idea that you could ever rise above your miserable station if you happen to be among the economically unfortunate, the chances of that are so slim that hundreds of people agree to go to this kind of island arena and compete in competitions that if they are on the losing side, they will be shot in the head or killed in some other fashion. But if they happen to be the one person standing at the end of it, there are riches awaiting them. And so
like the Korean Hunger Games or something like that.
It's like the Hunger Games with pornographic violence, and even more hopeless if that's possible. Yeah. But Squid Game is not, if you look at young adult literature, it's dystopia after dystopia after dystopia. Yeah. What is the single genre of our time that yields more entertainment? Because I guess that's the word than any other. Zombies, right? As I'm going to crib a line from an academic whose article I read, but AMC, as a cable channel, it exists solely as a zombie delivery system. No, I mean, there are so many iterations of The Walking Dead.
But how are zombies an expression of grievance?
They're tied into one of the most crucial dynamics right now that explains why grievance is more of a problem now and exists in a more pervasive and intense way. They are ambassadors of the ultimate pessimism, right? And one of the things that I think we don't reckon with to the extent that we need to is just what a turn we've taken in this country over recent decades. And it really has been over recent decades, even more pronounced over the last decade, from optimism to pessimism. It used to be that when you polled Americans and you said, do you think your children will have a better life than you did? You used to easily get a majority of yes, I do. That's not the case anymore. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Gallup since the 1970s, Gallup has anywhere from 3 to 5 times a year asked Americans, are you generally satisfied with the state of life? Or I forget the exact verbiage. It's in the book.
Yeah, it's right track, wrong track.
Yeah, but it's right track, wrong track, but it's differently worded. And up until 2004, depending on the year, depending on the moment in the year, you might frequently get more than 50%, sometimes more than 60% of Americans saying they were generally satisfied. And then maybe another time you would get less than 50%. From 2004 to the present, it's never been 50% or above. For 20 years running without interruption, a minority of Americans, 20 years without interruption, answer, no, I'm not satisfied. And more often than not, that number's below 40%, and it has frequently been below 30%. What does that do to the psyche of a country and to the nature of political debate? If you believe that tomorrow is not going to be brighter today, there's no chance of that. If you believe the pie isn't growing, your relationship to the people around you becomes less collaborative and more competitive, sometimes in a very cutthroat and petty way. it changes everything, and I think you see that in our politics in a very vivid way.
So that's the cue for me to tell you about my favorite New Yorker cartoon, which is two dogs go into a bar, and one dog says to the other, "It is not enough that dogs must win, cats must also die." Exactly. Everything is apocalyptic. The other guy isn't just wrong. He's not just your opponent. He's the enemy. He's a fascist. He's a Marxist. If he wins, it's the end of America. Right. I mean, we're in this really apocalyptic movement, and yeah, Grievance is an expression of that. So let's just talk a little bit about that. One of the things that Grievance expresses is a lack of civic virtue, and restraint, tolerance. Listening to the other guy. That used to be something that kept our politics pretty much between the 50-yard lines instead of from the end zones. And Frank, in his book, mentions a poll result that I always talk about when I give talks to groups, which is that there was a Pew poll done about 10 years ago that showed 60% of Republicans and 62% of Democrats said that they would be very disappointed if a child of theirs married someone from the opposite party. We think that's kind of funny, but actually now we don't even think that people from the opposite party are real Americans.
No, now guess who's coming to dinner? It's a Republican.
Yeah. So we've got this really apocalyptic, just hyper-polarized politics, and we know that negative partisanship is the biggest motivator of voter behavior. Negative partisanship is just you go into the voting booth and you cast your vote to stop someone from winning, not necessarily because you're thrilled about the guy you're voting for. So let's talk about some solutions, because you argue in this book that this is not irreversible, that we can do some things to make this better. One, of course, is to somehow bring up children who are willing to have some restraint and not to take some personal responsibility. And one thing I wanted to say about Biden, yes, he started blaming the elites, but he also didn't blame his staff. He said the debate performance was on him, which I thought was like an admirable and very rare thing to do. Okay, so let's talk about solutions. What can we do to be less aggrieved? Not that we're going to say that everything is fine. There's a lot of things to be angry about and want to change, but talk about what we can do.
No, I'm glad you said what you just did with those last words. There's so much to be angry about and so much to insist change.
Right.
That the problem is when you are angry about everything, it just all blurs together. There's no ability to distinguish the most important stuff. And because you kind of rightly took me to a little bit of task about Biden, I think Joe Biden's a very decent man. I really do. And for me, and I don't know if this will resonate with many of you, part of what is so hard about this passage right now is I feel like he has an opportunity to be the most kind of decent side of himself. I feel like right now he and the Democratic Party, I'm going well beyond the bounds of the book, and forgive me, but I feel like they have an opportunity to occupy and model the moral high ground that they're not seizing, and it just breaks my heart.
Meaning moral high ground equals dropping out?
To show that they can be self-critical, to show that they're not, to show that they have the bigness of mind and they can take enough of a long view to not just fall in line with the leader because the leader wants them to fall in line behind him or her. To kind of say in dozens of ways, the country's fate is more important than any one person's fate, more important than whether the inner circle have jobs the next day, et cetera. I mean, there's such a terrific opportunity right now to model something that, especially after the 4 years of Trump, and especially before what could be another 4 years of Trump, to model something that very much needs modeling. You want to talk about solutions? One of the solutions is for our leaders, not just in politics, but our leaders across the board, to behave in a way that doesn't give us permission to be the pettiest, angriest sides of ourselves, but that shows us how to be the best parts of ourselves, that sets a standard that's different. I mean, we have created permission for people to be awful. And shockingly, you create permission for that, many people decide, okay, I'm going to be awful. Solutions, politics, we have a primary system that rewards extremists. And that is, a problem across the ideological spectrum. Now, when I say that, I think the extremists on the right are a much greater danger to America today than the extremists on the left. I think you see pervasive and profound election denialism on the right in a way you don't see it on the left. You see political violence on the right to a degree and in a way you don't see it on the left. So this isn't a both sidesism.
So you're saying grievance breeds extremism, and
well,
vice versa.
It's a chicken egg thing,
yeah.
And we can change that. We can, there are debates about these things because we don't have enough examples yet to know exactly how it's going to play out. But I would like to see us at least try in more places than we currently try. Open primaries, nonpartisan primaries, ranked choice voting. I think all of those things combined, again, we don't know, we don't have enough evidence. My guess is they would lead to more moderation.
We have some evidence.
Which is not a dirty word, by the way. Centrist, moderate, those are not dirty words.
Who's from California or Washington State? Okay, so you guys have top two primaries. It means that whoever the top two vote getters could be two Democrats, they could be two Republicans, or one from each party, and they go off to a runoff. Ranked choice voting is just an instant runoff. That's all it is. Right. It's a little more complicated and less transparent. I'm a fan of open primaries because at least voters can understand what's happening. But it does mean that since everyone's voting in the same primary, politicians have an incentive to appeal to the center and to swing voters. And I think in California, there is some data that even though California is as blue as it always has been, the legislature is still mostly Democratic. More moderate Democrats, more Democrats who are willing to cross the aisle are going to Sacramento because of top two primaries. And just one thing, I don't want to take this away from Frank, but just one perfect example of this and why top two primaries actually work. There were 10 House Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump. 8 of them are gone. They're Liz Cheney or Adam Kinzinger. They were defeated in a primary or whatever. 2 of them are still here. David Valdeo from California, and I'm blanking on the guy's name from Washington State. 2 of them remain. Why? Because Washington State and California have open primaries. They could not have survived in a Republican primary.
Amen.
So anyway, that's the data for that. Okay, more solutions.
Well, I mean, I think we need to make an urge. I think we need to work much harder than we have. It seems hopeless, but I think we need to end the gerrymander in every place that we can end it.
For the same reason.
Yeah, for the exact
same reason. Yeah, because you need competition just like capitalism needs competition, democracy needs competition.
Absolutely.
And partisan gerrymandering means there's no competition.
Exactly, yeah. And there was, and people, that's one where people say, okay, well, that'll never happen. There was a story, I should come armed with the author of it so I could help you Google it, but there was a story in the Times, maybe 6 weeks ago, maybe 8 weeks ago, I'm not really good on that, about all the things that had happened in Michigan over the last 5 years that had changed the political climate there, and all of it was about citizen groups deciding, no, we will not live with this engine and manifestation of minority representation. No, we will not live with this. And it was all citizen-led. It was ardent. It was sustained. It was intense. And Michigan today more accurately resembles the sentiments of Michiganders than it did 8-10 years ago. It's doable, but it takes people really caring and making it, a front burner issue. Yeah. I mean, we have a decision to make. Do we want to live in a country where we're always at each other's throats, where when we kind of see someone pull into the parking lot, if their bumper sticker says a certain thing, we feel we better wide berth and not go there, et cetera. Do we want, governments that seesaw, between these two things rather than something that is closer to the center? I don't think we have to be, the last chapter of the book is all about humility, right? And what I mean by humility is I don't expect, and I don't think any one of us should expect, a Congress, a Senate, a Washington, D.C., or a world that conforms exactly to our liking. That's exactly what we want it to be. That's not the nature of life, and it's certainly not the nature of a democracy. But we're in this moment in time where nobody seems to be able to say, okay, I can give up this for that. I realize this isn't exactly how I would make the world, but we're all in this together, and I have to acknowledge that my opinion isn't the only one. Mine isn't the only welfare here, that the common good matters as much as my individual wants. We've moved so far away from that. There are things we cannot compromise on. I mean, there are examples of racism in this country that you can't just say, oh, well, a lot of people seem to be fine with that, I'm fine with that. But we all know there's a difference between things that cannot be abided and things that are differences of opinion. And again, we just conflate all of that, and we don't draw the sorts of, we're not discerning, and we don't discriminate in the good sense.
So there's a real connection between extremism, grievance, and minoritarian rule and minority rule. Those things are all feed each other. I just want to bring up one other solution that Frank has in his book, which I'm a big fan of, and then we can open it up to audience Q&A, which is compulsory national service with a military and non-military option for 18 to 22-year-olds. So you have we need more shared civic experiences. What you're describing at the Taylor Swift concert is a metaphor for how we've sorted ourselves out. Actually, sociologists call this the big sort. How we live in communities with people who look like us and are educated like us and worship like us and consume the same media as us. And we live in homogenous communities that don't trust each other. And that fertilizes grievance. So, okay, do we have mics or what's the system for this? Oh. Okay, great. So Geraldine will start.
I was just hoping you might tell us about the baby formula.
About the baby formula. That's such the great story that you have in the book about how it was totally false.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're Geraldine, right?
Yeah.
Can I just tell you, I've never met. We've never met, so this is genuine and whatever. You're beyond brilliant. And because of eyesight issues, I listen to more books than I read. I listened to Horse twice. And as you know better than I, it's not a short book, right? That had to take a while. Thank you for that and for all the work you do. Baby formula. I don't know I think everyone remembers that moment when there was a national baby formula shortage. And there was a Florida congresswoman, I'm not going to pronounce her last name correctly because I can pronounce nothing correctly, which is why I don't do radio or much TV. I can spell really well, so I stick to that. I think her name is Kat Kamek, and she was publicizing, spreading around these pictures that supposedly showed the stockpile of baby formula. It was a picture from a kind of migrant center on the southwestern border, and was saying this is being stockpiled here for people who've crossed the border illegally for their infants when Americans can't get it. And she was on Sean Hannity, and he went into and all through the kind of Fox sphere or whatever you want to call it, there was outraged social media, and it was all about the government making sure, letting them get something that you deserve, taking something away from you for them. Well, it turned out that somebody at CNN had the really kind of good instinct to just zoom in, to look at the boxes more carefully, and they weren't baby formula. They were powdered milk that was not in short supply, and that is used for much older children when combined with water. But for 3 days, 4 days, a whole week, on the political right, there was this outrage about the government actually giving migrants, giving people who immigrated illegally, something that they were depriving citizens of. And I begin the book with that story because I think it is an example and metaphor of how we approach so much in politics with how am I being shortchanged, who's doing it, how outraged should I be, and best of all, how do I get back at them? You know?
And misinformation and disinformation is about making grievance as intense as possible.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Would you please give us your take on how you would analyze grievance in the setting of what's going on the campuses at the end of this past school year, specifically relating, of course, to the whole issue with Palestine, Gaza, and Israel, and what the university presidents should have or might have done in terms of handling grievance in a more productive way?
That's a great question, and I'm a little bit, I don't really know how to answer it because while I like you, I mean, I assume this from your question, I believe a lot of university presidents handled elements of this in the wrong way. I can't imagine being in any of those seats during that passage of time. And I want to kind of humbly say, I don't know how much better I could have done. I might not have made some of the same mistakes, but I don't know that I would have handled any better. It was a very difficult time. I think the one thing I'll say, I'm just going to take one piece of your question. One of the reasons that I think so many students on certain campuses became as ardent as they did and began to kind of even behave and speak in ways that seemed not just sympathetic, but more than sympathetic to Hamas and that sort of thing, is, I talked about lenses earlier. In much too much of education right now, and all too often on the political left, there is this notion that if you have less power, if you have less money, if you have darker skin, you are inherently, ipso facto, the victim of oppression, and you have a voice and a kind of moral claim that trumps anybody with more power, more money, more stability, and lighter skin. And that lens ended up getting applied with shocking speed after October 7th. And it blinded so many people, young people in particular, to the savagery and the horror of that day. It blinded them to things like, I was shocked when I talked to students, they sort of saw Israel as this kind of extraordinarily lucky, blessed country. They didn't go far enough back in history to realize that to look at the people who founded Israel and to look at the people who lived there as the kind of ultimate won the lottery in world history was, no, but I mean, and that's the thing about history. How far back do you want to go to decide? We have these really oversimplified ways of analyzing these situations and of appointing people victims or villains, oppressors or oppressed. And that oversimplification, that generalization, that ahistorical orientation, I would say in this case, I think explains a lot of what happened after October 7th on college campuses.
And also, in that case, it seems like Grievance was the product of a complete lack of not just historical knowledge, but intellectual rigor.
Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely. I want to tell you something because I want to say something very sympathetic to maybe not the young people who were the most strident and the most unnuanced and the most ahistorical in their remarks. But I think it's always better to try to understand what happened rather than just kind of condemn it. And after October 7th, I was teaching, I volunteered to teach a first-year seminar because I had, till that point at Duke, most of my students had been seniors because I'm fortunate enough that seniors get first crack at signing up for classes, and I was lucky enough that my classes filled quickly. So I said, I want to teach someone other than seniors, and they said, well, there are first-year seminars. If you volunteer to do what many professors have to be forced to do and teach a first-year seminar, you'll teach only first-year students. And I said, great, let's do it. And I've invented most of my classes at Duke, and I invented a class that had the kind of all-purpose, meaningless title behind the headlines. And I really just wanted to create a class and a forum for us to they had to read the news very intensively every week. I gave them a pop quiz at the beginning of the class, that was based on current events just to make sure they were reading the news. And we would take something out of the news and we would talk about why are you getting the news you get? How can you be the most sophisticated, discerning, intelligent consumer of that news so that you kind of understand where it comes from, why it has the shape it does, and how you should receive it, blah, blah, blah. When October 7th happened, and it was a class of 15 students, but that was the limit, and I think about 5 of them were Jewish. October 7th happened, and several days later, we had class, and we started talking about it. And for starters, I talk about ahistorical stuff. Many of the students asked, and none of them could answer, why was Israel bombing Gaza? When it wasn't Gaza, it was Hamas that was the problem. And I said, do you realize Hamas is, for all intents and purposes, the government of Gaza? They had no idea. They thought these were separate things. But they had already been on social media and posted their reactions to it. And when I said the students give me hope, we ended up having this incredible conversation. I wish there'd been a video camera there or something, where they realized and talked about, and we all talked about the fact that in this social media age, they all feel the need when something truly enormous happens to register some reaction on social media lest they seem completely out of it and have their heads in the sands. But they don't know what they think, so they look to people around them, someone they admire, someone who seems smart, what did that person post? Okay, I'm going to repost that, and now I'm going to comment on it, right? Now they've taken a position that's utterly tribal and not informed by information. And some little corner of their brain knows that, so now they begin consuming the media and going out looking for validation and affirmation that they didn't take a silly position. So now they're filtering the world in a way that justifies what was a reflex or bias. And they become more and more convinced, because we're all vain, none of us wants to be wrong, none of us wants to admit error. They become more and more convinced that what they did initially was correct. And now you just kind of extrapolate forward, and you have the way in which social media breeds division and silos and all of that. So it happens for a reason. The reason is the universe we've constructed for them, and it's incumbent upon us, I think, from the time kids are very, very early, in school, at the kitchen table, on the soccer field, it's incumbent upon us to make sure they understand the way that world is influencing them and sometimes corrupting them, and that we give them a chance to behave in a different way within that world.
Yeah, and how to consume
I hope I'm
media
making sense. I feel like I'm
for
just rambling.
information, not affirmation.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I live in Tucson, Arizona for 6 months of the year.
Your state is an interesting place right now.
Oh my God, my state is a very
Did you read the
troubled-
George Packer piece in The Atlantic?
I didn't,
Yeah.
no,
You did or did not?
I did not.
I recommend it, yeah.
Okay, well, we are a tiny blue spot in a big red state that has lots of guns. We also vie with Mississippi for the lowest amount of spending per child for public school education. So I very much appreciate what you're talking about in educating the young people that you teach about how to follow the news, read the news, get an understanding of the news. But the real problem in this country is that the vast majority of the population is undereducated. And 50 years ago, Ronald Reagan and his administration dramatically reduced the funding for public school education. And my daughter, who is now 30 years old, never spent a day in public school in Tucson because we had the resources to be able to send her to a school where she could get a better education. So I think when you talk about grievances, you really have to look even further than the kind of grievances we're talking about right now, because we have whole reams of population who have real grievances against the system that has treated them so poorly.
You know, I mean, I agree.
Okay. I was sure you would, but I just think you always have to kind of look at that.
No, I mean, the only thing I agree with everything you said, and I think, you're talking in part about the death of social mobility in this country.
Yes,
or not the
100%.
death, but it's on life support.
No, it's gone.
When people no longer believe they have a chance, and as you so eloquently just said, they often believe that with great cause and for very good reason, they're right. But when they believe that, of course, they're going to be less invested in the civic experiment. They're going to be less invested in the common good, and they're going to go through life angry.
Right.
One thing you said, though, that made me want to mention something I think we don't mention that often, and I actually thought it's where you were going to go when you were talking about education, is, I'm kind of talking about how we get kids to be more kind of conscious and responsible users and consumers of social media. So many people actually not only don't have much information, but don't care about having much information.
No.
And I don't know how many of you saw this. This story would have blown my mind, except I've encountered this too often, and you have, I'm sure, and I'd love to hear you on this when you go to political rallies or when you just kind of do the kind of interviews with voters and diners. There was a story in the Times about, it was over 10% of Democrats blamed Biden for the end of Roe v. Wade.
Yeah. Oh, I've encountered that tons
Democrats,
of times. Sure,
right?
Absolutely.
So we
Yeah.
do political analysis.
Have you ever sat in on a focus group?
Yes.
It'll curl your hair. People they're filled with knowledge. It's all wrong.
Right.
And they're very adamant about it. Yeah, that they...
And the greatest, I'm curious who agrees, I think the greatest flaw in so much of the political analysis that people like Mara and I do is there's no way to do it. There's just literally nothing to write and no way to do it without assuming a fundamentally rational electorate. And let me tell you, that is a huge assumption.
That's a
What do you
huge
think?
assumption. Yes.
What do you think about it?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that's one of the biggest problems. I mean, one way to address grievance, I think, is obviously to have a better, more equal education system, to have what we used to have, K through 12 civics education, where, how would you know if a democratic institution is being undermined if you have absolutely no idea what its purpose is in the first place? I mean, you've all seen those late night comics who send out the guy with the microphone on the street to ask people what are the 3 branches of government, and nobody can tell them. But also, in a modern version of K through 12 civics education would include media literacy, which what Frank is just talking about. How do you check sources? How do you spot a conspiracy theory, et cetera? Anyway, there's so many things that we could do to change all the forces that lead us to be so aggrieved. There's somebody back. Oh, right there, yeah.
Hi, this is probably a great spot for me to jump in and ask a question about religious literacy. I just graduated from Harvard Divinity School in a new program that was designed to bring in 10 people from around the world to help translate religious literacy out into culture. And everything that you've said tonight, I can affirm from being in the epicenter of what I would consider to be the most contentious space at Harvard in one of the most contentious years at Harvard. And I want to push back a little bit in this room, just play the devil's advocate, just so that we all as readers have something to chew on as we head home tonight. I'm from the South. I heard you say that you're teaching at Duke. I'm from Augusta, Georgia, and Atlanta, Georgia, where the inroad when it comes to trust and having someone listen to you is respect for that person's religious perspective. And one of the things I noticed at Harvard this year is amongst progressives, and I live in Vermont now, so many of my friends are some of the oldest hippies and progressives in the state of Vermont. I would say, though, that amongst progressives, I found, personally, my 2 cents, very low rates of religious literacy. And what I found was an assumption that the kind of education that you get when you are at a private school or in an elite institution is the only kind of education that can basically traffic in knowledge. And what we have right now, I believe, in culture is being reflected in our candidates. And what I would challenge our room to think about, and what I'm very interested in your perspective on, is how do we be more self-reflective, which I heard you say in your comments, and challenge ourselves, how are we not understanding the people who are reaching out for help and finding solace in someone like Donald Trump? And so the humility that you're ending your book with, and I'm looking forward to reading that, the humility would lead to then a self-reflective question. How do we better understand this cry of despair amongst many of the people that I grew up with, instead of insulting them by saying they're not educated, insulting them by saying the work that they do with their hands isn't as good as the work I do on Wall Street or in Martha's Vineyard. So I just appreciate that, and I'm very curious to see how you're learning as someone who's living in the South now and teaching at Duke about religious literacy. Thank you.
Thank you. It's interesting. I mean, I'm sorry you left the microphone because I wanted to ask you a question. Is part of your question driven by something that concerns me? Oh, thank you, yeah. Is part of your question driven by something that concerns me, which is we talk a lot about certain kinds of bigotry, but I think in many corners of our society, certainly corners I travel in, there's a bigotry about religious people. There's a notion that anyone who's deeply religious must be kind of fundamentally not with it. Is that part of what drove that question, or?
Religion is on the rise globally. So if you respect people around the world who live outside of America and those that are flooding, coming in to live here with us, understanding how significant religion is to most people in the world, that might answer your question. I don't know. I'm just in terms of statistics of people that are people of faith around the world. That's their primary driver.
Right.
Their primary driver in life is their relationship to their faith, not their educational status.
No, I totally understand. I'm saying,
Yeah.
do you believe, as I do, that many, let's just talk about Americans, that many Americans actually condescend to people of faith. Many Americans who are not people of faith.
I certainly feel that in New England.
Yeah.
I felt that at Harvard, and
Yeah.
I feel that in progressive, quote unquote, educated spaces. I personally, I'm not saying that to be judgmental. It's a curiosity I have. Yeah.
And that's a really interesting comment at a time when we have a president who goes to mass every single week. Just putting that out there.
But we have an ex-president who's selling his own version of the Bible.
Yeah, right.
Good evening. I have read your book, and I thought it was amazing. And like your writing in general, I just find your compassion so helpful in these troubled times. And I'm a psychologist, and I use your book to help my patients. And politics has entered the therapy world in a way that, as a psychologist, it's incredible to me how much of people's individual lives are consumed now. And the piece I would appreciate fleshing out a bit more is the difference between grief and grievance. Because many people are truly, and I think myself included, justifiably grieving. I am grieving that I'm not leaving the world I wished and assumed I would leave to my children. That, my kids are not going to do better than I did. And, I grew up in a very basic middle-class family, back when one earner could provide, and we had, I grew up on Long Island, and, we have our family of 5 and a 1-bathroom house. I didn't feel like that was, I was like everybody else. That wasn't like a hardship to have 1 bathroom in a family of 5. Who today would think about that in this element? And so this notion of I am truly grieving for the state of the world, which is different from grievances. And if you could pull those apart, I think that would be very helpful for me, because I want to figure out how to help mobilize people in grief, which is a different source of energy than a mobilization around grievance.
I don't know. Thank you for sharing that. I don't know the answer to your mobilization question, but I was thinking as you talked, it was so interesting. I mean, obviously we're talking about words with a common etymological root and with a lot of letters in common, but I think they've actually kind of forked in very different directions. When you were talking about grief and the way you were talking about it, you're talking fundamentally about sadness, and grievance is fundamentally about anger. And I think anger is the much more corrosive emotion. I mean, I'm not an expert on this. And that's the kind of thing that comes to mind. I think when we lead with anger, whether it's in the arena of politics or in any other arena, it doesn't end up in a good place, I don't think. What do you think?
Can I just follow up with that to say, but I think, which is what your book is so powerful about, is we actually don't give people space to grieve in this country. And so, but we do give space for people to have grievances. And,
we reward them for that.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if somebody dies, you get 1 hour off for the funeral. If it's, an uncle, you get a day. If it's a spouse, you get a week. I mean, we're very, grief is not something that we really allow people to process it, from my perspective, sufficiently. And so I think it's much easier than to have it turn into a grievance, whereas if we could uphold the powerful need for people to grieve appropriately, it might be a way to shortchange some of the grievances.
But it sounds like you're saying that people are grieving the end of the American dream, that their kids won't do as well as they did, even though they've tried to do everything right and work hard and get an education, et cetera. It sounds almost that
that's just one aspect of what people are grieving. I mean,
Yeah.
people are grieving, addiction, and they're grieving, blah, blah. I mean, the loss from COVID. I mean, grief is happening, somebody dies, or whatever. But I'm just saying that we as a culture, I think, don't allow people to grieve. And so to me, in terms of it's not just the word source, that the root, I think it's a society then with all that grief that has been tramped down, that's another reason, the fertile ground for grievance, because that I do get rewarded for.
Well, it's interesting as you talk about that, I'm flashing on, and maybe this is because of the very smart comments the last person at the microphone made. I'm flashing on those places in the middle of America that have turned toward Trump with such enthusiasm. And they are places that lost so much. Factories,
Exactly.
lives to opioid addiction.
Right.
And you're right, in that case, their grief,
Exactly.
unattended,
That's right.
unrecognized to the extent that they felt would have been correct and would have dignified them, turned into grievance.
Yeah, thank you.
We're sort of circling the word illiteracy. It's come up a few times. I wanted to know if you connect the national problem with illiteracy with children and the fact that people who are illiterate and illiterate are shut out of our society in terms of making their way upwardly. So there's a tremendous schism between people who can read and have access to education and those who don't and can't and are shut out. You've touched on it in your columns a few years ago, talking about a nephew and encouraging reading.
I can never remember what I've written.
It was
I don't think it tracks that neatly. I mean, we started off this evening by talking about Samuel Alito, who, whatever his many other copious flaws, presumably reads very well, right?
Right.
It's interesting. There was some. It's a joke, but it's not a joke. I mean, if you go back and look at some of the most interesting reporting, and NPR did great reporting on after the January 6th rioting and the breaching of the Capitol, the people who were there. They were not illiterate people. They were not even, like, more of them were upper middle class professionals than was the stereotype or profession. Some of the
Who
most
could pay for a plane ticket to Washington.
Right.
And yeah.
Some of the most aggrieved people. I mean, one of my favorite deconstructions of January 6th actually was a podcast that NPR ran called "Will Be Wild," which was just terrific, and it was a really good portrait of the fact that one of the things that is so tough to figure out and so kind of fascinating and unsettling is that grievances right now do not correspond with who has reason to, who's been shut out, who's been, I mean, there are aggrieved people in that group, obviously. But what's really weird is in places where there's no cause for it, there's no justification for it, none that you can really see. And now I'm not talking about those places in Middle America that have been devastated by globalism, et cetera. People who just don't have a world that is exactly to their liking or whose lives have fallen incrementally short of what they thought was their due, they're the most aggrieved people of all.
Right, but the disinformation, the rise in disinformation, if you don't read widely or deeply, it's very easy to
Sure.
fall for this junk.
Yeah.
Right? So.
One more? All right, so how about just these guys, and then, is that okay, Sue Ellen? Okay.
Hi. Yes. Yeah. Questions. Hi. I'm actually here with both my parents tonight, and this has been such a lovely conversation to listen to. Also scary. And when I think of grievance and I think of grief, I also tend to think of hope. And I haven't read your book, but as somebody who has been very tapped into multiple different kinds of news sources, it is draining and it's exhausting, and I'm scared. So I want you to talk a little bit about how we can hope and see how this could get better. And I think of people who have spoken about how they feel their kids might not get to the level of the American success that they have. So I'm curious about your thoughts.
It's a great question. I'm cautiously hopeful, but I am hopeful because I think when we turn in certain directions, we see all sorts of examples and models of a better way. Someone a bit ago mentioned Vermont, right? Phil Scott has had some of the highest approval ratings consistently of any governor in the country. and he's the Republican governor, or he was the Republican governor, I forget, is he still in office? I should know this, he still is, right? Of a blue state, right? Andy Beshear has great approval ratings, has been elected twice in Kentucky, very, very red state. Larry Hogan in Maryland when he was governor. Charlie Baker in Massachusetts when he was governor. And you can find examples on the other side of the aisle. All around the country, there are politicians who are modeling a consensus-oriented compromise approach to leadership that tells us that there's an appetite for something different, that there's a better way. And I think we can draw hope from them. And I think we need to work harder to lift them up and to kind of talk about them and to give them the sort of attention. It's a cheap and easy way to get attention, and we in the media abet it, to just kind of scream. Those people who are whispering rather than screaming, they model something different, and it is incumbent upon all of us, including very much Mara and me, to spend more time writing about and singing the praises of those people so that they end up having a traction tantamount to the kind of traction that a certain 78-year-old who talks about electric boats versus sharks and Hannibal Lecter as a role model have, you know.
Thank you.
I'll be short. I'm Jay Thies, and I think that one of the issues that I'd love to hear you talk about is what for me is the subtitle, or the sub-issue here, which is the weaponization of misinformation. And I think that the press has a lot to do with that, because in my own judgment, even the cable news stations that we like are creating their own news, and they're the news and they're the entertainment. But to find the facts, and I do thank you very much because I listen to NPR all the time, but there are fewer and fewer places where you can find actually the facts in, quote, the daily media that's available to virtually everybody. And then, and that I'd love to hear your comment about. And my other quick comment is that you spoke of the first article of the Constitution, but of course the grievance that was redressing was the lack of right of citizen participation. And now the grievance is simply a harm. If I'm harmed, I have a grievance and there must be a redress somewhere. And I think we're in an era where populism obviously is on the rise throughout the world. And in our own country, I'm sad to say, although I am a Democrat and prefer the Democratic point of view, the party point of view, I'm sad to say that I think both parties were more interested in being elected than in governing. And here we are. Thank you.
Thank you. But,
Oh,
no, it was more of a comment than a question, but thank you for it. Thank you. No, that wasn't it. No, thank you all for coming. I mean, I will say, I was gonna say something about your comment on the media, which is well taken, but what media? Like,
yeah, there is no one monolithic thing. And that's one of the reasons why grievance can take hold in the way it does, because there's no shared set of facts.
That's right.
We don't sit down and consume 3 broadcasts at night, and that's a real problem. I mean, you can't have a civil society, you can't have a real conversation where you start with a shared set of facts and work your way to opinions instead of the other way around, right, and solve problems. I mean, you can't. If your whole idea of politics is as performative, yeah, and owning the libs or owning the MAGA, yeah, it's a problem. And it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. I mean,
no, I could not agree
although one
more.
of your solutions was to repeal Section 230, or to allow people to treat internet purveyors and users as actual publishers.
Yeah, Meta's a publisher, yeah, X is a publisher.
Yeah.
I mean, to
as opposed to, yeah.
I mean, to end on a hopeful note, or like something you can do, you know, and to kind of pivot off your comment about media. I will say this: you're getting the media you ask for and want or deserve. I don't have the right verb, in a way you never did before, and I don't think people realize
it's
that.
all out there. It takes more effort to find it.
But also,
yeah,
whether your relationship, let's take the New York Times for an example. When I joined the Times much longer ago than I care to give numerical specificity to, you know, if we wanted to know what people were reading, we had to convene a focus group. We had to do a reader survey. Really blunt instruments, that yielded unreliable information because people are just answering, and sometimes they're flattering themselves. Oh yeah, I spend all my time with international news, and I never, and I never look at any other page. Now, we know exactly what everybody's doing. Not individually, it's not a nanny cam thing. But there's actually a kind of tool within the Times that I can go to, and I've never gone there because I'm way too thin-skinned and I have way too many issues to do it, where I can look and find out anything I've written since a certain moment of time when they came along with this tool. I can see how many people opened it. I can see like what percentage of them got to the end. I can see whether they went there by a mobile device, whether they did a Google search, how they arrived there, whether they saw something on a social media platform that got them there. Knowing what people read with that specificity and reliability obviously influences what you give them because it's a business. And you're mixing the high-minded with the things you need to do to stay in business. You're mixing the Beirut Bureau with recipes and Wordle, right? That's the way you stay around. I would, after the 2016 election, when I would be like in a group like this for whatever reason, I would always get asked, why did you all write so much about Donald Trump? One problem with that question is it presumed that all of that helped him and most of that coverage was negative, and so I'm not sure I accept that proposition. But I would always turn it around and say, why did you all read so much about Donald Trump? If people had been clicking in the same numbers and with the same interest on the stories that ran about, to go back to that Republican primary, on the stories that ran about John Kasich, within a matter of weeks, if not days, you would have seen tons more about John Kasich because it's all known in real time, it's all registered with exacting specificity, and it all matters. You have greater ability right now to influence the news you get if you realize that every keystroke you make is recorded and consequential, and so you can change that at least to some degree.
Well, although that raises the question of why should the New York Times base its coverage on how many clicks these stories are getting?
Thank you.
Because
Thank you.
No. I mean, it's a good question, but not to be a Times defender. I have plenty of issues with the Times. But if you don't find some balance between giving people,
you're not going to be in business.
It's Wordle and connections and the crossword and now strands. Now I'm doing strands. If they come out with many more puzzles, I'm not going to be able to do anything else during the day. But I mean, that helps fund. I mean, we still have international bureaus like nobody's business, and our international bureaus. That's you have to do some click stuff to support the non-click stuff.
Frank told me that he loves to take questions, and we've just seen a great example of it. So please join me in thanking Frank and Mara.